So hey everybody, welcome to This Month in Procurement on the Art of Procurement. I'm Philip Ideson, the host of the show, and I'm joined as ever by Kelly Barner. So Kelly is the owner and managing director of Buyers Meeting Point and also the general manager here at Art of Procurement. So Kelly, thanks for joining me again this month.
Hi Phil, hi everybody, Thanks for listening.
And before we just jump into it, I'll give a quick review of the format that we have here in this show that we do every month. First of all, we just look back on the pods that we have published on the Art of Procurement in the last month or so. We'll then have a main topic that Kelly and I are going to jump into. Just to tease that a little bit, we're going to be talking about planning for 2020 and how we can all kind of think about that. And then we'll just share with you what we have coming up on the pod next month. So first of all, without further ado, let's jump straight into the shows that we had on the pod this month.
Yeah, the first pod that we had, actually I have to say this particular guest, we only had on the pod because we were trying to make him feel good about himself. We wanted to make sure his voice got out there, and he's been asking for a really long time to get to come speak. Yeah. I'm teasing, Phil. You were a primary guest for the first pod that we had this month.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I used to do this a lot. You know, in the first year of doing the podcast, I would have a Friday show where it's like a 10 to 15 minute show every single week that complemented the main show. And it took so long to do those things that, I ramped it back a little bit, but I still always enjoy the opportunity to talk about, some of the experiences and some of the insights and what I'm seeing, as I'm on the ground, helping a lot of folks with their own procurement transformations.
And I think that's really important. I mean, it's one of the things that for anyone that's in our position where we're covering the space, writing about the space, reading about the space, it is so incredibly critical to remember that boots on the ground view. Yeah. And so I think anything that you observe in those circumstances is extra valuable because not only is it firsthand experience, but you can then kind of combine the 2 points of view, right? Where you think about, what's the really high level view of what we're trying to achieve and the major topics being discussed. And also what is the reality of what professionals and organizations are dealing with?
Yeah, I think, sorry to jump in, Kelly, but I think it's really easy to get, I try and think what the word is, but essentially disconnected, I think from the reality. Yeah. Because it's all well and good, talking about, well, procurement should do this and procurement should do that. But the reality is that we deal with so many different challenges on a daily basis that, unless you're really involved in those, they probably don't seem as important to you until you realize that, no, these are real challenges and real problems that we all deal with when we're working in procurement as practitioners every single day. And super important, obviously, to kind of bring that context to all the conversations that we have.
Yeah, well, and the devil's in the details, right? Yeah. So it's one thing, and for instance, so your topic in this podcast was gaining executive buy-in when you're trying to lead a procurement change initiative. And okay, change is hard, right? I mean, that's something everyone is going to agree to. But the reality of making that change happen and making it happen successfully when you're on the ground, one of the things I thought was particularly interesting is that you didn't so much start by focusing on the change itself, but you actually started by advocating that people stop and ensure that they do a reality check around self-awareness so that they understand the true nature and scope of what they're trying to change. Why do we have to start with a look at the status quo before we're looking to drive change?
Yeah, I think it's just, if you don't know what's broken, how can you fix it? And, the whole idea of this, the episode that I put together was that we may all have our own visions of what procurement can do and where we want to take procurement. And, that may be transformational. It may just be evolutionary. It's not to suggest that every change that we want to see is some, great departure from what we've been doing in the past. But at the end of the day, we've got to sell that to our executives because we've talked until we're blue in the face about the importance of executive buy-in, especially when we're working with folks to try and change their hearts and their minds. But a lot of times the execs don't even really know what procurement can do, or they have this idea of what traditional procurement used to do. And that's what stuck with them because perhaps they had a better experience. So actually understanding where your executives are in terms of their perception of what you do and the perception of what procurement can do and the reality of how they see what you're doing today For me, I don't think that you can start to build a future state and start to plan for a future state until you have covered that, because ultimately that becomes the elephant in the room. Is if they don't believe in what you're trying to do, then they're not going to support it and they're not going to give you the cash to invest in it. True.
Now, can you build self-awareness? Can you do a self-assessment yourself? Or is that truly an activity where in order to gain the appropriate level of distance and objectivity, you have to either go to, an industry colleague, someone in a different function, someone on the executive team, maybe bring in a professional third party. Do you have to take that step, or is there a way to get purely internal distance?
It's a really good question. I think that it depends. It depends on the structure of and the resources that you have access to internally. Some organizations will have, for example, a PMO group or some kind of change and transformation function. That function may only be one or two people, but there may be people who exist in the organization who can drive those sorts of conversations. You may be a procurement leader who is particularly self-aware and who has the ability to encourage the people around you to share what they're really thinking. But the reality is it's probably easier if you get some help from a third party. And I'm not saying that to kind of advocate for, hey, let's go and do that. But there's that distance, and then that drives openness. The other thing that is always interesting to me when I go in there and have these conversations is that there's, as an external consultant, you don't have to deal with politics particularly.
True.
And there's always kind of ulterior motives behind what people talk about when they're just doing internal to internal conversation. So I don't ever want to say that you have to go and get that sort of help from outside, but I think that it can help shortcut the process unless you have some very specific talents within your team that you can rely on.
Yeah. Now, one of the other things that I always associate with change management, and maybe this is me, right? I don't know how many people share this feeling, but, I hear change management and I start to think, there's that, I think it's a 10-step scale that a lot of times they'll have posted in doctors' offices, especially if they're ones where children go or where there might be a language barrier. And it's everything from like a horribly grimacing face to like the happiest face you've ever seen on this 10-point scale. When I hear change management, I know which face I'm thinking about, and it's not the happy face.
Yeah.
Do you find that people are generally adverse to change, concerned about change? And is there a way to make people actually feel excited right from the get-go about the potential of what that change might mean for them?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that most organizations, folks are more comfortable with the status quo. Now, where I've seen it goes back to selling that art of the possible, and where I've seen teams who really embrace what the future can look like, that's because you've painted a picture of what it can be. And you're not making it about the fact that they have failed. That's something that I see too often is when you talk transformation. I know I've talked about this on the show before. It's like it's positioned as everything that was done before and all the people who did it before were bad. Yeah. And therefore everything has to change, and that includes bringing in a bunch of new people. Well, the reality is that there's so many factors that go into why a team were not performing the way that you potentially wanted them to, that goes way beyond the talent of the team. So, when you ensure that they know they're part of, that there's an opportunity for them to be part of the future. The reality is that when you go through this process, there may be people who just don't stand up to the plate, and that happens. And that's not a bad thing either. But you want to give everyone the opportunity. So selling them on what the future can look like, I think, is a really good way of inspiring people to want, or those who want to change will be inspired to change. And of course, some won't make it along the way. But that's kind of how I've always approached it.
And then, of course, the next thing that I think becomes difficult is, how many of these change management initiatives kick off to great fanfare and then just sort of like fizzle. There does have to be a certain amount of formality around planning, but then also what, in fact, are the shifts or the results that this change is expected to deliver, something measurable. I mean, in procurement, we're never going to be that far from things that can be measured.
Right.
What kind of planning is required to make sure that not only does the change carry all the way through and people don't just get tired and go back to the way they were doing it, but then also to say, we've put this many man hours or we shifted this many processes, but look at what we've delivered. It's not just different. We're being very specific. What have we delivered as a result of this? Yeah,
what I would say to that is that transformation or change or evolution or whatever it is, it never stops. And so it actually shouldn't necessarily be considered something with a start and an end. It should be more of a continuous improvement. And on that continuous improvement journey, then there'll be times in that journey where the change is perhaps more acute than at other times. But the moment that you stop and say, okay, I mean, I'll go back to your original question. It requires a lot of planning. It needs to be coordinated. You can't just sit down and expect change to happen. But don't just get to a point in time on your timing plan and say, okay, we've achieved everything we wanted to achieve. Now it's business as usual. Because I don't really think there is such a thing as business as usual. Because then, everybody kind of will get back into their old habits and old routines if you don't continue to drive and inspire and motivate and challenge and measure and all those things related to keeping it sustainable.
So what it really comes down to is you have to own the change.
Yeah, I think so. The challenge is, when people talk about the fact that there's constant change, it's typically because you go through a change journey and then you stop, and then a couple of years later, you're perhaps not kind of where you wanted to be, or things the business around you have changed and you haven't changed, and all the different factors that came into the fact that you wanted to do a transformation in the first place become present again. And so then you do another transformation, and it's this cycle, and you see it all the time. It's like a 3-year cycle of change, getting to this back to the status quo of whatever the new change is, and then you need to change again in another year. So I would stop thinking about it as something with a beginning and an end and just a continuous improvement.
And one of the things I think about, and I imagine back to all of the big companies that I worked for, it's much easier these days. I know everybody that I work with very well. But when you work in a large company, you had talked about maybe there's a small kind of task force or team that's been tagged, to work on these kinds of projects. Or maybe there's just somebody internally that has extensive project management experience or change management experience. Companies don't do a great job of allowing us to discover and leverage that internal knowledge, do they?
No. And, that's where often you find external third parties brought in because, they want to change quickly, and it's kind of this risk aversion. Because if they bring in somebody from the outside, one who has the very specific specialist skills that they're looking for, there is the ability to hit the ground running with that, as opposed to perhaps putting that trust in one of their team members who they may not know, who may not have had the opportunity to demonstrate those skills in the past. But then there's always someone to blame if it goes wrong. And it's much easier to blame somebody on the outside. This goes back all the way to something that stuck in my mind from Rory Sutherland. I think it was back like 160 or 70 was the episode number, talking about risk aversion and how, people often make decisions based on mitigating and minimizing their risk as opposed to maximizing their opportunity. And using a third party is always a way to minimize the personal risk of something going wrong.
And that, in fact, it's funny. It's one of those things where we're fighting nature, right? We're not really hardwired to embrace opportunities quite so much as we are hardwired to minimize risk.
Right. No, that's for sure. And it's completely understandable, but that's ultimately what ends up happening.
Yeah. Now, I think maybe the final thing that's interesting, and this actually carries us over nicely as we start to look at a special series that we ran this month. One of the things that sounds like it's important with a change initiative is kind of hitting the gas really quick and delivering something small but meaningful very quickly. What kinds of things would you deliver on, a very short timeline, but that are substantial and meaningful enough to help people realize, okay, it is worth getting behind this. This is a legitimate initiative.
So I'm going to answer it again by saying it depends. And, you know, this is, there certainly is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach. And the reason I say it depends is because it really ties back to when you do your self-awareness and when you, and this kind of second element that I recommend after a self-awareness is then understanding in detail the business challenges and opportunities, like a needs requirement. So you look at the self-awareness, which is what was the perception of procurement before. You look at what the business needs. Well, what are the tasks or what are the actions that you can take and what are the results that you can deliver, which quickly speak to the fact that this time is different? Because, you know, the one thing that really derails so many change journeys is the fact that we do all this talking and this is, you know, as consultants, I think is a challenge is you talk a good game and you paint this picture of the future and everything's going to be wonderful and rosy. And then the first time they have an interaction with this new procurement, everything's exactly the same as it was before. So, you know, it can be perhaps if you have a reputation of being, you know, very bureaucratic and red tape as a procurement function, it's going through a project, a sourcing event, or whatever it may be, and showing a lot more flexibility than you used to. It doesn't have to be driving like hard savings. It could be driving hard savings. You know, that's something that I think is the go-to for procurement to show value, because then that's a way of getting additional investment when it's tied directly to that monetary value. But it doesn't have to be that. It can be changed behaviors or changed approaches that are just a different way of doing things than what we've done before. And again, all really ties back into what's the perception of procurement? So where are you trying to change? And what does the business really need from you?
Yeah. Now, one kind of change initiative, sort of big scale, but I think it applies a lot of these things that we've just been talking about, is something that we addressed in the 5-part special series we did with Efficio about a CPO's first 100 days. I mean, if you think about, certainly transformation is huge and deep and wide and all of those things, but perhaps nothing is more transformative than literally changing out the person that is leading a procurement organization. And so we spoke to 5 members of their team and got fantastic input on completely different points of what are the things that you really need to consider and make an impact on during those first 100 days. And in fact, delivering quick win savings was one of those.
Yeah, and I want to. I really enjoyed that series. You know,
I did too.
I want to thank Efficio as well for supporting us in putting the series together. You know, it was something that we did for the first time really on the show, and yeah, talking about quick wins, like jumping into that, the interesting thing of that was I talked about savings as being a quick win. Well, the conversation that we had there with Sushank from Efficio was around how do you do that without upsetting all your suppliers and all your stakeholders right off the bat?
Make sure everybody hates you by day 99.
Because that's why when I talked about continuous change, that's usually why it happens is you go in there, you go and save money at all costs. You know, the first 18 months you're showing some great returns, and then when the business changes, everybody hates you because you've upset everybody while you're extracting all these savings, both the stakeholders internally and your suppliers. You know, one of the things that Sushank brought up was how oftentimes, like, suppliers have had lots of ideas about how to save money and nobody's ever listened to them before. So just listening, there's so many areas of potential collaboration to drive down cost and drive down price, but it doesn't mean necessarily driving down the margins of your partners. It's working together to find ways where maybe some things are overspecified, or maybe metrics are, you just got too high requirements from a metrics perspective, which is driving up their cost to serve. And there can be some really easy things that help reduce cost quickly without just going and beating up all your suppliers.
Right. Well, and I would also think so if this were me, right, if I was taking this advice and I was, day 7 of my first 100, I think one of the other things I would be concerned about is it is so hard for procurement to escape this image that we're just a savings factory, right? And on the one hand, everybody says, oh, procurement only cares about savings. But on the other hand, the only number they ever pay any attention to that we share is the savings number.
Right.
So they kind of reinforce it and judge it at the same time. Is there a concern that if you emphasize even just quick win savings in a first 100 days, that you're creating a future branding problem for yourself?
I think so. It comes down to a balanced scorecard in my mind. So, as a new CPO, obviously one of the first things you'll be doing is understanding what's important to the business, and building your scorecard based on what's important to the business, of which savings no doubt is one of those things. But that's the best time for you to be able to talk about non-savings value levers, because you're basically setting the scene for the next 2 or 3 years. But you're right, if you go in just going and saving money, while there may be a lot of money to be saved on the to take off the table, I think it's how you message that, and message that as being part of a broader strategy. Because you're right, otherwise we continue with, well, procurement just does cost savings.
Yeah.
And you talk about how that's how we're measured. So, but I think that it's on us. I always think that it's on us to change people. It goes back to what I said at the very beginning around painting the art of the possible. Like, how can we expect people to measure us in any different way if all we've ever done is talked about cost savings?
Well, and Simon talked about repositioning procurement.
Yes.
And I think the interesting thing about that is in the context of it being a CPO's first 100 days, certainly the organization had something in mind when they were, whether the former CPO chose to leave or, whether they just decided, we need somebody else. We need to change this role. There's both the idea that anytime you change someone in a position of that level, the company takes it as an opportunity to say, okay, what do we want this to be? What do we want from this person? What do we want from this team? But then the CPO coming in also has an opportunity to reposition the role of procurement. And it's kind of change on both sides, which makes me feel like it's a really opportune time that if everybody is kind of open to this idea that some things are going to be shifting, both the person coming into the role and the company looking to the person in that role to deliver savings, value, risk mitigation, right, whatever it might happen to be, deciding what you as the CPO want procurement to be, again, savings just being part of that, it is an opportunity that you have to take quickly, because if you don't carefully map that out, you're just kind of going to fall back into either what they know or what you know.
Yeah, you kind of have this honeymoon period at the beginning. And it reminds me of another solo show that I did probably 2 or 3 months ago around building the idea of this executive governance and building like a board of investors. Like, who are the people who are going to invest or decide that the company will invest in procurement versus making a decision to invest in another area of the business? And this, again, is the perfect time to bring that group together, to position what that group will be so that everyone's on the same page. Because, if you don't do that, then you'll end up going down the same path of, maybe there'll be a business unit that prefers to work or that enjoys working with you more than another. So you put your resources against your advocates, and you continue to kind of permeate this split that often occurs where some part of the business don't really want to work with you, other parts of the business really enjoy working with you, and the ones that don't then complain about the fact that they get hit with a central charge, for example.
Yeah.
I've got to pay so much of my budget towards procurement and I'm getting nothing in return.
That's right.
And that's when it starts to you kind of go down that path again of needing to transform again. So, it's so important to get the first, 100 days right.
Yeah. Well, and it's nothing if not complex, right? Which is what we heard from Ryan Flynn from Deloitte when he shared the results of this year's CPO survey, which was really interesting. And I'm actually glad, if they were going to pick a word to characterize their findings this year, I'm really glad that they picked something that wasn't procurement specific. I mean, complexity is everywhere. It's in business, it's in personal life, it's in procurement, it's in finance, it's in operations, right? It's something that everybody can connect on because it's something that we're all trying to handle right now. And yet it wasn't, I didn't think it was. I don't know if you did. It wasn't a negative report. And the fact that they focused on complexity, I didn't think at all, if you read it, you didn't come away with the feeling that, oh, things are a mess. Like complexity did not necessarily correlate to bad or out of control or messy. Did you come away with a similar?
Yeah, it is an interesting approach for Deloitte. You know, it's the first time they've really taken this tact, I think, with the annual survey that they released to really focus around one particular topic or theme, of which then to build everything else out. And the other thing I would say with complexity, like I agree with what you said. It's easy to try and make complexity an excuse.
Agreed.
And it wasn't written in that way of, everything is hard and it's complex. So, you
don't hold yourself too accountable.
Yeah, you can't really blame yourself because things aren't how you would want them to be.
Yeah.
But just acknowledging that, I think it's interesting then when they go down the route of talking about, what makes a complexity master. And, we see this in other surveys where when you look at a maturity kind of continuum, there's the people at the top, the pinnacle, the world-class leaders, or in Deloitte's case here, the complexity masters, about the things that they do and the things that they don't do. And, those don't necessarily differ from company to company, but what I realize more and more is how few of us have achieved that kind of level of impact within our organizations.
No, totally agree. And an awful lot of it has to do with mindset, right? How do you, when faced with complexity, what's sort of your gut response? Is your gut response to entrench and protect what you're doing? Or is your response to like, okay, let's first make sure everything's stable. And then let's step back. Okay, so this has happened. What can we make of it?
Yeah.
And I think it's just like we talked about the fact that our nature programs us to be more a risk-averse than opportunistic. I think it's very much the same in the face of complexity. Very few of us see complex situations, say, "Oh, now's the time to experiment with something we've never tried before." Right? So I think in a lot of cases, it's probably you need someone with the right level of influence and the right mindset and the willingness to take that leap, and has the team to back them. That's sort of a very special sauce that you're only going to find in so many companies.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look, from a holistic level of these surveys, like the Deloitte survey. Here we are in 2019. 60 days away from 2020, and we're still talking about a lot of the things that we were talking about. If you go back to 2009, what's 2020 going to look like? Well, we're probably saying the same things as we're saying today that 2030 is going to look like. And I know that I've talked about that before, but it's also an interesting time to kind of reflect on that, because I asked Ryan in the pod, you've been doing the report, the Deloitte CPO report. I think it was its 8th iteration. Are we moving in the right direction? And I think he put on a kind of a good face to say, yes, we are. And I don't doubt that, from what I see, but are we doing it at scale? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. No. And so, to that point, as you and I have this conversation and record this podcast, it is the morning of November 1st, which is terrifying, not only because now everyone's house is full of Halloween candy, that if you work from home, that's like working in the middle of a minefield. Right. But it also means we are literally counting down the days. And 2020 is no longer this, future like the cars are going to fly and the dinners are going to cook themselves. It's literally, 2 calendar page flips from being what we write down on checks. And so as busy as things are, and as much as we're all rushing to do whatever we can in those 60 days, we have to carve out time to figure out, okay, are we going to be ready on January 1st to make the most of next year?
Yeah.
And it's something that, you and I have certainly already talked about doing, and that we're going to practice what we preach, and absolutely make that investment at Art of Procurement.
Yeah, and so we have our offsite, our AOP offsite coming up in a couple of weeks to really think about what 2020 looks like, the goals that we have, how we want to continue to deliver value to the procurement community, how do we want to do that in different ways. And, as we're doing that at an organizational level, I think at a personal level, this is always a great opportunity as well for us as professionals to kind of take the same stock, because I'm not sure if I really ever used to do that so much when I was on the practitioner side, probably because I never had the time. Now it's only now I realize the importance of creating that time. To really like what do I want to be known for in 2020? What are the things I need to do? How do I need to plan it out? Because before you know it, it's going to be the end of the first quarter.
No, it absolutely is. And the funny thing is, as much as that's a very logical statement to make, I think there's two pieces in what you just said that it's actually really important to pull apart. So the first one is, what do I want to be known for, right? And what do I want to get done?
Yeah.
Because it would seem like if you do a good job getting done the things that you want to get done, then that's what you'd be known for. But in reality, that is not how it works. They're sort of two completely separate efforts that have to be linked consciously and purposefully, just like any of the change planning that we've talked about. But you can't assume that, oh, if your messaging is right, then they will come. Or if we do a really good job consistently in the same areas, people will know us for those things and the phone will be ringing off the hook.
Right.
You have to both do the work and get the word out there in the right way, remaining authentic and delivering a good product. But really have a plan to make it all come together.
Yeah, and I think for us, when I speak personally, I think it's bringing more clarity to the things that we do. When I try and take that step back and have a think about the self-awareness from our procurement perspective, like what do we do and how in which areas do we focus and how do we pull kind of all the things that we know into a single kind of the message and the story. And that's the same for all procurement groups. Like it's got to be tied to, because ultimately as a procurement function, you are selling your services to the rest of the business. And, you may be in a manufacturing firm where you're in direct procurement and you have a strong mandate where people get fired if they don't use procurement. But even then, it's still your success is based on relationship. And for the 95% of the rest of us, we're in a service business. And the same things that apply to us in trying to find our message and find our focus apply to anybody who's trying to set their procurement group up for success next year.
And as much as, again, you're trying to either literally sell your services, in our case, or if you're internal, you're trying to make people aware of the services that are available to them. But you're also really promoting yourself, right? When you're in a knowledge economy, when you're in a services economy, research and development, if we can pull that over from manufacturing, it becomes an investment in you. And it's more than just personal branding, because you go back to that. Yes, it has to be what are you known for, but what you're known for also has to be based on what you're capable and interested in delivering and bringing those pieces together.
Yeah, and I would also say when it comes to branding, again, personal branding, organizational branding from procurement group, from us, from an arts procurement perspective, is kind of have the courage, and I'm saying this to myself as much as anything else, like, have the courage to speak up for what you believe in, because it's really easy. Here we talk about change and all that kind of things, but it's also really easy to just maintain the status quo and be in a position where you're not provocative for the sake of provocation,
right?
But for being true to the things that you believe in, as opposed to just kind of keeping quiet because you don't want to upset anybody. Because opinions, ultimately you'll have people who agree with you and people who don't agree with you, and if you don't give those opinions, then no one's going to disagree with you, which seems like easier than having a bunch of people not really believing what you believe because you're being more probably bolder in the things that you believe.
Well, and isn't that sort of the funny double-sided catch of social media, right? Especially for us, right, where we tend to do a lot of our work virtually. Many of your interactions are on LinkedIn, they're on Twitter, and sometimes you're out there and you kind of feel like, am I talking to myself? You're like, am I connecting with anybody? Am I just posting these great pictures and sharing these links? And certainly there's great interaction, but I think, and there's plenty of examples of this, it is always about, if you're going to do something bold, it's not just being bold for the sake of, oh, if I post this, everyone's going to freak and then they'll all know my name. Well, that's not productive. It's about, okay, if I'm going to come out and make a very bold statement or a bold prediction or challenge someone on something, which is what we all profess to want to do, but let's be real, that's scary, right? We're not programmed for that, and that's not always opportunistic. It's about saying, okay, I've been presented with an opportunity. I have a very specific reason for taking this bold step. But then, as you said, and you can be talking to me on that one as well, because that's one of those things that I think I also struggle with. I tend to take the safe path, is in fact, once you have the opportunity and the justification, having the courage to act is, kind of closes the loop, and all of us need to push ourselves to do that.
Yeah, so that's going to be it's going to be front of my mind for sure going into 2020, is probably not being afraid to share some of my stronger opinions.
And just like we're doing here, opinions about what we think, but also, okay, I'll be honest, I struggle with A, B, and C. I'm sure a lot of other people struggle with these things. Let's all figure it out together. Because if we're truly promoting ourselves, then it's an investment in our skills around knowledge and experience and presentation abilities and the way you approach complex situations. If we're not always learning, then we have a stagnant product and you can't increase market share. I mean, it really is. It's a small product introduction over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I want to tie this actually back for any listeners who are maybe earlier in their career. And I'm only tie this back, saying it to my personal circumstances. I was, first in procurement for the first few years. I always used to think that if I said I didn't know something, that it was a sign of weakness. And that my leadership team would think, well, he doesn't know anything about this, so he obviously doesn't know what he's doing. And so, you would plod on regardless and perhaps make a mistake, or a situation would become worse because you were afraid to share the vulnerability of not really knowing what to do. And as I spent a little bit more time, I realized how that's, people want you to be open. They want to help you. And that by showing vulnerability isn't necessarily showing weakness.
And it comes back to the communication skills. So, I can certainly think of situations early in my career where I was in the exact same place. And then I think somewhere along the way, probably in consulting, it's two places in life where you learn all the important stuff, on the school bus and in consulting. I remember hearing someone else in a meeting. There was sort of something in the air that was presumed, like, okay, we're going to make a change or we're going to do it this way. And the reason wasn't clearly expressed. And I know for me, I wasn't totally clear on the reason, but it wasn't my meeting to run. And someone else spoke up and said, I'm totally with you, but let's keep in mind that this is something we're going to have to explain to other people. So just so that I can share this with your full intent and with your rationale, how would you explain that decision to a group that we needed to win over? And I thought to myself afterwards, because I had a little bit of context, I thought that was the $1 million way of asking, why should we do that? Right? So it's not about being deceptive. It's not about being slick or pretending that you know something that you don't. But, as you get to higher levels, it can be harder to say, yeah, I'm sorry, I just don't follow. Why? Why? As opposed to saying, okay, so we're going to have to do messaging around this. We're going to have to roll this out to a larger audience. We're going to have to build consensus. Let's start right now defining the way we want to present that, because in presenting it, they're basically going to answer the exact same question, and you move a step forward towards, the next steps that the group has to take. And so sometimes it's about having been in enough meetings and having a few of those things in the back of your mind about, oh, I remember the time that, Sean did this. I can ask the question this way. That's kind of the benefit of experience.
So I know we're coming up on time to wrap today. So let's go into what we have coming up for the rest of November. And do you want to take the webinars and then I'll take the pods?
Sure. So November is actually a double AOP Live month. The first AOP Live session is with Parangusta on November 12th. And That's on holistic procurement performance management. And I think if there's one line that comes away from that, it's actually in the description on the landing page we have out there. It's this idea that, there's what procurement wants to accomplish today, and there's what technology and automation can do, and both are important. There's a gap in the middle, and what needs to fill the gap? It's our people, because there is a space between technology and results, and people have to be able to fill that space. So we're doing that on the 12th. And then our event on the 20th is actually rescheduled. For anybody that had been following, we were going to be running a session sponsored by Evalua with Joseph Yakura. He's a career-long former CPO, and he was going to speak to us about data quality based on the 3rd annual data quality and governance study that he did in conjunction with Rob Hanfield at NC State. And this poor guy, the night before we were supposed to do AOP Live, he lives in California where all the wildfires are raging. And he called and let us know that he and his family had been evacuated from their home because the fires were starting to encroach on the area. And he was willing to plug ahead. Right. But sometimes, even in business, you have to say, Joe, it is okay, family first.
Yeah, you got bigger priorities than doing a webinar with us.
Yes, exactly. And so, for everyone else, that's an opportunity, if you've not already registered, to get on. There's a few weeks to register for that one. Really fantastic early looks. The report is not out as of this recording, but we have some really interesting early looks at not only the importance of data quality, but the business challenges associated with its absence. So we have 2 live events there this month that people can sign up for.
Yeah, and I will add the links to the show notes page for today's episode, so you can go and look at those events directly, register for those events directly. So the show notes for this week are going to be at artofprocurement.com/episode 281. That's episode 281. And there'll be links to both those AOP Live sessions at the show notes. And then when it comes to podcasts this month, so we'll be speaking with Bill Michaels. Bill is a good friend. He's an informal advisor of Art of Procurement. He's also the Vice President of Operations for North America for SIPS. And I'm going to be talking with Bill about an update on tariffs. We had Bill on the show about a year ago when the US tariffs the policies around tariffs were starting to be put into place. So we're going to have an update on that. And we're also going to talk about how procurement leaders can begin to prepare for the next recession. And the next recession, who knows when it's going to happen? I think if we're all betting, if we could all bet on when it was going to happen, we'd all be rich.
Especially if we were right.
Yeah, right. That's what I mean. So I don't know when it's going to happen, but I think it's time to at least start thinking when it comes to a business cycle, what are some of the things we can do to prepare ourselves? So that's what Bill and I are going to be chatting about in that one. And then we have another podcast, which is going to be with David Ray, who is now Chief Product Officer of Procurement Leaders, and Jerry Craven, who is a Principal Analyst at Procurement Leaders. We're going to be talking about expanding procurement's value levers and also the findings. And it kind of ties in with the findings from their 2020 CPO planning survey. Then we're going to do a show the week of Thanksgiving. We'll still be here Thanksgiving. What that's going to look like, we're just trying to figure it out at the moment, but we will still be here Thanksgiving week. So with that, Kelly, I just want to thank you again for joining me on This Month in Procurement.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks, Phil.
And we'll be back doing the same next month. Hopefully my voice will have returned. It's better today than it was when we originally were going to record a couple of days ago. It
is. That's true.
But with all that being said, I just want to thank you all for listening in. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us. We're always open to receiving anything that you've got to share with us about the show, about things that you would like to hear from us, about guests that you would like us to consider, whatever it may be. You can do that by going to artofprocurement.com/contact. There's a contact form in there, or just on any of our social media channels like LinkedIn and Twitter, wherever you see us. And just one final thing, just as a reminder, if you would be interested in looking up those 2 AOP Live sessions that we have later in November, artofprocurement.com/episode 281 is the place to go. So with all that being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll be back again and talk to you soon. Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.